Today, we're going to look at this video right here titled How Capitalism Destroyed the Internet. As you can see, it was put up by a channel called Second Thought, has 1.39 million subscribers. This video has already over 200,000 views after about a week. With that said, let's check out this video, How Capitalism Destroyed the Internet.
This episode is brought to you by Audible. Get your first month absolutely free by following the link below.
All right, already we got to pause. He's trolling us at this point, right? For those who don't know who Second Thought is, he's a Marxist, socialist, propagandist, as I would call him. And he starts this video about how capitalism destroyed the internet with an Audible promotion. For those who don't know, Audible is owned by Amazon. You know, one of those scary big tech monopolies. Whose business is primarily on the internet. This is a video titled How Capitalism Destroyed the Internet, put out by a socialist propagandist, hosted and distributed for free on Google, another big scary tech monopoly. He's probably making money off of Google ad revenue via corporations. He's making a lot of money off of Patreon. I checked earlier, this guy has roughly 3,900 Patreon subscribers. And he's also making money off of, or at least trying to, off of Amazon sponsorship programs. I'm starting to wonder if this guy is like an Andy Kaufman, Sacha Baron Cohen like troll, just fucking with us.
The world's dankest, sweatiest, Reddit shitpostingest tryhard, Mr. 2015, ifunny.com himself, just bought one of the internet's 3 websites. So this week, we're looking at how capitalism ruined the World Wide Web.
How capitalism ruined the World Wide Web.
Just about everyone has a problem with the internet. We all use this necessary service for a million different things, and for many of us, we've even gotten to the point where we spend more time online than we do touching grass. Worldwide, both the number of internet users and the average amount of time spent online have gone up. So the problems that come with the internet are not just more obvious than before, they're also more important. They literally take up more of our lives. I'm not about to explain how the internet is important. You don't need me to hold your hand like that.
Thank you.
But rather that this kind of significance is why changing things about the internet has become a political topic, with slogans like break up big tech picking up steam in recent years. Same with calls to tackle internet surveillance, censorship, misinformation, disinformation, lack of access, harassment, doxing, spam, and scams. Everything that's wrong with the internet is just too important not to fix. But it doesn't seem like it is getting fixed.
Now, some of these are legitimate political issues, I would say, and I would say the proper solution to all these problems, like scams and harassment and others, is to apply the law, apply individual rights to the internet. Did someone use the internet to harm someone else or harm yourself? That's when you get the government involved. And you give the accused their day in court to defend themselves. You guys get the picture.
Every year, tech companies will come out with a statement or ad campaign telling us that they're more committed to privacy, diversity, and inclusion than ever before. Before doing not that, and say, totally fictional example of course, giving police access to a teenager's DMs so they can find out if she had an abortion.
All right, so already Second Thought here is dropping some context. He's already dropping some context, folks.
No surprise there!
So he's only showing the headline of this article from Forbes, written by Emily Baker White. And if you read the article, which I have right here via Apple News, if you read the first sentence, it says a Nebraska teenager is facing criminal charges alleging she aborted a fetus in violation of state law after authorities obtained her Facebook messages using a search warrant. Which sounds to me like Facebook had their hand forced in this matter. They were forced to hand over this information because this teenager was unfortunately breaking the law. So I think with a case like this, I don't think the problem is Facebook. I don't think the problem is capitalism in the internet, but rather the problem is restrictions on abortion in states like Nebraska. And I think the only solution to this is to convince the voters, the good people of Nebraska, to vote on laws that put these abortion restrictions to an end. Vote in politicians that roll back these bullshit-ass restrictions. I don't think it's fair. This is a problem, but I don't think it's fair to blame this on Facebook or capitalism and the internet.
or turning over security camera footage to law enforcement without a warrant or consent.
All right, and this is a headline from The Intercept by Sam Biddle, written on July 13th, 2022. I think he's again dropping context. Not showing the full article. Unfortunately, this article is behind a paywall, so I'm unable to scrutinize it. Stupid capitalism and the internet. But I did find a similar article published the same day on The Hill, written by Chris Mills Rodrigo on July 13th, 2022. And they add some context, saying that a Ring spokesperson defended handing over footage without permission, saying that the law authorizes companies like Ring to provide information to government entities if the company believes that an emergency involving danger or death or serious physical injury to any person, such as a kidnapping or an attempted murder, requires disclosure without delay. Ring faithfully applies that legal standard. So it's not like, it doesn't sound like Amazon is just eagerly, happily giving away everyone's data to government entities. It sounds like they only try to do it if they think there's an emergency going on. And maybe there is a question as to whether or not Amazon takes liberties with this legal standard. And I would say, thankfully, we still have a free press and free speech that can blow the whistle on these stories so that we can have a healthy discussion about it, add some much-needed context, and give consumers information that they might need before deciding to get in on this service. But again, I think Second Thought is being a little dishonest here with his presentation.
Or churning out a new generation of far-right clowns by platforming the most ghoulish reactionaries.
Far-right clowns. We're going to come back to this.
And it's not as though our governments are any better. As the Snowden leaks made abundantly clear, the internet has become a mass surveillance soup they can dip their ladle into at any time.
So I guess NSA, the impression I get is he's blaming NSA and government collection of data on capitalism and the internet. Keep that in mind.
For most of us, it feels like the internet is simply out of our control. We can complain all we want, but ultimately only something like YouTube can actually change what's wrong with YouTube. And YouTube can only do that while remaining profitable. It's not really for us to say what we want the internet to be.
Yeah, and Google spent over $1 billion to buy YouTube. And I imagine they did so on the expectation that it would ultimately help make the company more profitable in the long run. And again, I think what's often left out of whenever we read about market acquisitions and consolidation and monopolization. What's often not discussed is the people that created YouTube, who, from what I've read on this, they did not have the money necessary to fight a lot of legitimate legal battles like libel and slander and copyright infringement and whatnot, not to mention all the infrastructure and hosting costs and all that. So they were able to unload it to a large corporation, and they got filthy rich doing so. I might ask you guys, don't you guys think that's wonderful that we still live in a world where if you create something like YouTube, you can make a lot of money? I think it's wonderful.
Internet to be. At the end of the day, the best we can do is tantamount to slipping a note in a suggestion box. And there's a reason for that. Ultimately, the root of most of the problems with the internet is that the internet is a business. But it hasn't...
I would say the internet is more like a market. It's a collection of businesses and private entities and individuals and consumers. It's not just like one business.
But it hasn't always been. The internet that we know today began with the creation of a government institution called ARPA, the Advanced Research Projects Agency. It was started by the US government in February of 1958. And that date is important because it's just 4 months after the Soviet Union had successfully launched Sputnik into space. Right in the middle of the Cold War, Sputnik's launch by the Soviets stoked fears of falling behind here in the US. And given the lack of innovation from the private sector to compete with what the USSR was getting up to,
lack of innovation from the private sector,
America decided it was time to prove capitalism was the superior economic model.
Worth reminding people, this is a point I like to make. In 1918, the Soviet Union was born, and Sam Walton was born, the founder of Walmart. And I might ask, who do you guys think figured out how to fully stock a grocery store first? The Soviet Union or Sam Walton?
Model by getting the government involved. So the US created ARPA, later to be renamed DARPA to be clear that it's a military institution, then back to ARPA because it just sounds better, and never mind, now it's DARPA again.
Yeah, going back to NSA, when he casually just threw in the NSA collecting data as if it's capitalism's fault. But when he talks about DARPA and ARPA, he seems to seems to think fondly of it. Hey, it's the public creating the internet. I guess that's socialism. That's good in the eyes of second thought. But the NSA, the government collecting data, I guess that's capitalism's fault. Funny how that works.
DARPA created what's usually considered the first public computer network, ARPANET, the thing that would eventually become the internet. A network between computers of DARPA's researchers it hoped to take to the battlefield one day. And the fact that it was created in the public sector had some important consequences. The first consequence is that it exists. The internet couldn't have existed without the public sector. Not just because that's how history played out, but because the private sector literally wouldn't have done it.
The private sector literally wouldn't have done it.
Blow it out your ass.
By all accounts, the internet was far too expensive to create, took way too long to be developed, and was widely discredited as unprofitable by the private sector at every step of the way.
Every step of the way. Too expensive. The private sector would never invest in infrastructure like the internet. Never.
And this isn't a hypothetical statement. The private sector literally didn't want to create anything like the internet.
They literally did not want to create anything like it.
Years before ARPANET, the Air Force had tried to get AT&T to build its own version of a computer network without success. And even once ARPANET was fully built, at that point the most advanced computer network in the world, AT&T still wanted nothing to do with it. It just wasn't profitable to make something like the internet. So it had to be built without profit in mind. And the
just not profitable.
scale of how much creativity this kind of project took is often understated. Back in the day, a bunch of old fogies used to liken the internet to other public works projects like public roads, with names like the Information Highway. But that analogy only sort of works. The scale is completely different. The internet as a government project could only be compared to the highway system if the government, quote, had first imagined the possibility of cars, subsidized the invention of the auto industry, funded the technology of concrete and tar, and built the whole initial system. It is a public creation from the ground up. And that had other important effects. DARPA researchers were contracted out from a bunch of different places, but were required to work together under the same public roof, forcing the internet to develop collaboratively. That means with a common language and cross-platform compatibility right from the start. Signals and information needed to be sent over wires as much as they needed to be sent over radio waves, and with reliable, readable instructions in order for data to get to the right place, regardless of the path it would take. Unlike in the private sector, where the dominant logic is to lock people into a proprietary ecosystem and language, the public sector, and the necessity for the internet to be accessible by as many people as possible, meant universal codes. The internet was developed with a set of shared, universal protocols, and this was accompanied by the requirement from DARPA for different contractors to share their work with one another throughout the development process, under threat of losing their contracts, meaning that the first steps of the internet were deeply open source. The innovations made by one team carried through the system to be built upon by others instead of being shielded by competitive secrecy, as would have undoubtedly happened with a profit-driven, intellectual property-heavy capitalist model.
Yeah, this is believable if you can only ignore and get past the long history of companies, especially tech companies and internet companies, working together, often working together despite being in competition with one another. An obvious example of this being that Google and Microsoft have applications available on Apple computers. I remember getting my first iPod when I was in high school, and having to get iTunes, which is created by Apple. iTunes and iPod were both Apple products. iTunes was Apple software, and I was using it. I was using a Windows XP computer to sync it with my my library, to sync my MP3 files to my iPod.
And this kind of collaborative ethos and total disregard for profitability carried into the physical world too. To try to develop the reach of the internet, the government funded regional public networks throughout the US, more specifically for a collection of universities and institutions. Networks did not go where the money was, they were built where they were most useful and where they could most effectively be a true public service. By 1986, this approach had made ARPANET essentially too successful, and more people, researchers especially, wanted to get access to it. This led to the creation of another net, NSFNet. The idea behind NSFNet was to create what the author Ben Tarnoff, check out this book, calls the main artery of the internet. All sorts of different physical internet networks would be connected through a main, central, and importantly, public network. But here again, this worked too well. Thanks to the expansion of the network and the creation of a user-friendly hyperlink system, also a public innovation, not just researchers, but more and more everyday people were interested in getting on the internet. By the early 90s, demand had shot up, more than the system could handle. And suddenly, all those private sector executives changed their minds about this whole internet thing.
You guys getting this? He said by the 1990s, demand for the internet had shot up more than the system could handle, and suddenly the private sector changed their mind about the internet. And you gotta wonder what factors played into this. What factors? Like, what did not exist before the 1990s that may have spiked demand for internet access? Well, from what I've read, there are two things. I've read a variety of sources that said this, but here's an article from the National Library of Medicine via the National Center for Biotechnology This is an article from all the way back in 2001 titled A Brief History of the Internet and the World Wide Web. In this article, you will notice it says, with the advent of TCP/IP, the global network became a reality. Universities and government offices and agencies increasingly use the network for communication. Up to this time, the Internet was, by law, strictly for official use. And later on in this article, it talks about how up until 1992, it was technically illegal for businesses or private individuals to operate on the internet. So I wonder why the private sector did not have much interest in the internet prior to the 1990s. Maybe one of these big reasons was the fact that it was illegal for them to do so. I feel like this would be talking about like the 1920s America and the decline of like alcohol production without any reference to prohibition or the 18th Amendment. Be like if Second Thought just talked about the 1920s as, yeah, you know, the private sector in the 1920s, they just lost interest in making alcohol and alcoholic beverages. Breweries shut down, wineries shut down, distilleries shut down, bars and restaurants stopped serving alcohol. Yeah, they just lost interest in making alcohol, I guess. But I think another factor that may have spiked demand in the internet that could not have been possible in the 1970s or the 1980s, and this article even talks about this, talks about, however, personal email addresses became commonplace and games began to be played over the network. Unofficial use of the internet gained impetus in the 1980s when personal computers by Apple and IBM became common in both offices and homes. This is something that jumped out to me like, yeah, of course the 1990s may have seen a spike in the internet because before the 1980s and 90s, computers were not that ubiquitous. They were not really available or usable by the general public, especially in the 1970s. It's not like the 1970s. It's not like any computers could have processed high-definition 1080 videos, much less a Fortnite video game that would spike demand for the internet. So how did computers become ubiquitous? Well, it was largely due to greedy corporations like Apple and IBM and Microsoft and Dell Computers and many others who constantly improved in computers. And you're going to see one of the common themes in this video is this disregard for the private sector and competition and the profit motive, and the fact that it often results in innovation and lower prices. And if you guys don't believe me, I've talked about this before, but there's this article on Twisted Sifter that shows pictures of this old Best Buy ad from 1996. You'll notice they have computers on sale, like this Packard Bell here on the left. This Packard Bell computer, it's on sale for the low price of $1,798. As you can see, this computer has 8 megabytes of memory, 720 megabytes of hard drive space. I guess that was state of the art in the 1990s. And fast forward to today, about 26 years later, this is Best Buy's website. Now you can get a personal computer that has 8 gigabytes of memory, so about 1,000 times as much as this Packard Bell computer, 512 gigabytes of storage, so about 700 times as much storage space as state-of-the-art in 1996, all for the low price of $529, which even before taking inflation into account is less than 1/3 of the price as it would have been in 1996. And I wonder why this happened. I wonder what got us from this point to this point. And I'm just going to let you guys on a little secret. I don't think it was from socialist politicians declaring personal computers human rights before trying to impose price controls or to try to build a publicly owned computer company to meet the demand of low-income Americans. So what changed in 1990 that may have spiked demand in the internet, in the private sector? I'm going to guess it was the ubiquity of personal computers. This would be like being perplexed that the private sector in, say, Miami Beach, Florida, hasn't provided a healthy supply of snowmobiles. It's like, yeah, why would people want to produce snowmobiles in Miami Beach, Florida? Why would the private sector have much of an interest in the internet in the 1970s when nobody had a computer to even get on the internet and use it in the first place? A problem that was largely solved by greedy corporations like Apple and Microsoft and Dell Computers and many more.
After decades of rejection, capitalism wanted in, so it happened. Following the boom in interest of the 90s, the internet was privatized in two big ways. The physical infrastructure of the internet was privatized, and with it, the interface. First, the privatization of the infrastructure happened in 1995. That's because, right beforehand, a false dichotomy had started circulating in the American government. Either the internet would remain what it was, a network that largely supported researchers and had limited use, or it would become privatized and allowed to grow in scale to meet demand.
And keep in mind, the title of this video is, again, how capitalism destroyed the internet, mostly starting in the 1990s. And I gotta ask you guys watching this, anyone in their right mind who is not a complete Marxist moron, do you guys think that the internet was better prior to the 1990s? I don't know about you guys, but I would say... Speaking of which, you know what? It might be time for like I feel like Abe Simpson in this meme. You know, I remember it being 1996 and checking out the internet for the first time on my dad's Packard Bell computer that ran on Windows 95. And first of all, it was America Online. You had to dial up and call the internet to get on. It was primitive compared to today. It was all chat rooms. All it was chat rooms and emails and news articles and some primitive games. All I remember playing is multiple choice trivia like Nickelodeon trivia or World Wrestling Federation trivia. And now 26 years later, people are complaining that there are, too many entertainment streaming options to choose from, to the point where it's like if you get all of them, you're paying more for a cable television package. Too many gaming consoles and online gaming services to choose from. Does anyone think that the internet is worse today than it was before the 1990s?
This is a false dichotomy because nothing stopped the kind of scaling up promised by privatization happening within the public domain, except for neoliberal ideology.
Oh no, neoliberal bootlickers!
In 1995, Clinton was in the White House, and the political backdrop against which the internet was fighting for its life as a public service was at the height of neoliberal hegemony.
Neoliberal bootlickers!
Public services of all kinds were on their way out, because it was decided that unadulterated, all-encompassing market capitalism had won the ideological war when the
Maybe second thought is the real Ralphie the Revolutionary.
USSR ended. Politics in the imperial core was no longer about debates over power and ideas, it was about technocratic, pragmatic solutions to precise, identifiable problems. Politics became about the nuances of capitalism and very little else. Francis Fukuyama called it the end of history. Margaret Thatcher said there was no alternative, and Tony Blair insisted there are no left-wing or right-wing politics anymore, only politics that work. Privatization wasn't a political question anymore, it was an obvious answer. It was inevitable. The only question was about how privatization would happen, not whether it would happen at all. This is why, when telecom companies began lobbying for privatization, they got it.
Good.
In the usual way privatization happens, the argument centered around competition, the battle for innovation, the lowering of prices. But the reality was...
Yeah, again, the innovation and lowering of prices. Again, kind of showed you guys right here. We got some innovation and lowering of prices, at least in computers.
Was that only 5 companies had the means to privatize the internet, and therefore, from the very first day the internet was privatized, it was under a market oligopoly. To this day, only 6 companies handle the physical infrastructure of the internet, and just 4 companies, Comcast, Charter, Verizon, and AT&T, provide 76% of internet subscriptions.
Oh no, you guys. 4 companies provide 3/4 of these subscriptions. Although I guess there is something to be said about like local governments creating monopolies by locking out competition. I know this is more of a problem with like large apartment complexes and condominium complexes, but it does appear that cellular networks are making this less of a problem. They've made it less of a problem over the last decade with innovations in cellular data services. This is an area where I think Starlink, Elon Musk's company, is disrupting, entering competition without, the need for like physical cables and whatnot. And keep in mind, there were our billionaires like Chris Sacca, who claims to have wanted to give away $20 to $25 million gift to the city of San Francisco by offering a network that would be anonymous with no ads. And it'd be a gift to San Francisco. And you know what stopped him from providing internet, him and his friends from providing internet, $20 to $25 million gift to San Francisco? It was government regulators, folks.
No offense, but it sounds like some fucking commie gobbledygook.
But remember, guys, I guess it was capitalism that really destroyed the internet.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
The public networks run by the government stopped expanding or were shut down entirely. And after billions spent in development, the government turned over the internet to profit seekers almost overnight.
Oh no, not profit seekers!
The consequences of this are obvious. ISPs have no reason to provide internet to everyone, only to those from whom they can expect to make a profit.
Goddamn right. How many times has he said the word profit in this video? You guys noticing a trend? His emphasis on profit motives and making money.
Unsurprisingly then, 1/3 of Americans don't have broadband access, and those
1/3 of Americans don't have broadband access. If you look at his sources, you guys know what his sources for this talking point? It's a Bernie Sanders website, as you notice down here. He links to a Bernie Sanders website. I don't know how true or accurate this is, but I did find an article on the FCC's website that talks about this, and according to this article, the number is actually closer to 6% instead of 33%. Also, according to the U.S. Census, which the FCC uses as a source in their broadband reports, at least 85% of households in the U.S. had a broadband internet subscription as of 2018, while some households without a home internet subscription relied on smartphones for internet service. The FCC also links to Pew Research articles in their reports, one of which reports that 91% of adults either own a smartphone or subscribe to a home broadband internet service. Anyway, back to the video.
have broadband access, and those numbers obviously skew against the poor.
And he says it skews against the poor. Again, we have billionaires who are trying to make it easier for low-income, poorer Americans to access the internet. And it's not capitalism that's preventing them from doing so, folks. And again, according to the FCC, this seems to be a bigger issue with rural areas, not necessarily the poor.
Through a series of deals to stay out of each other's way, ISPs are free to price gouge. Just look at your internet bill and the tens of billions in profit a company like Verizon makes every year.
Now, this doesn't prove anything about price gouging. He just says look at your bill and then look at the billions they're making every year, where if you look at the profits of the large ISPs like Comcast, Verizon, and AT&T, they do consistently make profits, but over the last few years, you don't notice a significant jump. Here's Verizon, for those who don't know. This is their net income history over the last 13 years, according to Macro Trends. Looks like they're actually down since 2022 started. But overall, it's pretty steady, pretty reliable. And I'm wondering, like, what's the big deal? What's wrong with the company making profits? Notice his emphasis on profits.
It's why Americans pay some of the highest internet prices in the world, twice as much as Europe.
But more importantly, what he just said doesn't show any data that that Americans have been paying a lot more, that price gouging is going on, so to speak.
And usually for worse service. More recently, we've seen this trend go global. Companies like Meta and Google are getting into the infrastructure game too, buying up and building some.
Wait a minute. Did you guys get that?
More recently, we've seen this trend go global. Companies like Meta and Google are getting into the infrastructure game too.
Oh, so private companies are getting in the infrastructure game, as it turns out. Remember, he just told us that, without the benevolent public sector, the internet never would have happened. Private companies, they never would have invested in infrastructure.
More recently, we've seen this trend go global. Companies like Meta and Google are getting into the infrastructure game too, buying up and building some of the undersea cables that take internet access throughout the world, especially in Africa, to develop both their reach and their control. But
So, what's the problem here? You know, I found this article that he is talking about right here, and it's a very long article. I have not had the time to read it. But even if I'm to take a second thought at his word here, that these large corporations like Google and Facebook are investing in internet infrastructure right after I'm told there's only 4 companies that provide internet and that the private sector never would have developed infrastructure. But also, a lot of this infrastructure is focused on expanding internet access to more people, particularly in Africa. After, again, I'm told that the reason why poor Americans, 33% of Americans don't have internet is because of greedy corporations and capitalism. But if I'm to take them at this word, so Meta and Facebook and Google, they're investing in infrastructure to bring access, internet access, to more people, particularly in Africa. If you ask me, that sounds pretty cool. But I guess a consequence of this will be a long-term profits for these companies. And I guess we can't have that.
But physical privatization was mirrored in the digital space. With internet access opening up with demand in the mid-90s, a flood of websites popped up to populate the web. This led to the infamous .com bubble. And from the fact that it's called a bubble and not the .com massive success / best event of the century maybe ever, you can probably guess where things went.
Yeah, I mean, the tech boom of the 1990s, I think, was still largely a success looking back, despite some of the failures that we may have seen. I think this would be like analyzing Michael Jordan's basketball career based on the fact that Michael Jordan missed most of his shots. Be like looking at it like, oh yeah, you hear about Michael Jordan's career. You see all of his trophies, his MVP trophies, the championships he won, the scoring titles he won, all of the fun he had, all of the success he had. But did you actually know that Michael Jordan missed over 50% of his shots? Doesn't sound like that great of a basketball player to me.
By 2000, over 280 .com stocks, the first websites that had gotten big with investor money despite rarely proving they could turn a profit, crashed.
Well, wouldn't that be a good thing? You know, I get this impression that profits are bad, but being unprofitable is also bad. Which is it? And yeah, there was a lot of malinvestment during the so-called .com boom. I'm not denying that. Malinvestment existed even prior to the internet. But I don't think people making bad investments proves this notion that capitalism destroyed the internet.
$1.7 trillion disappeared from the stock market in just over 6 months, and it led most people to think that the idea of privatizing digital space was basically impossible. But it wasn't. A few companies had figured out that in order to make money on something that could just as easily be free, they would have to monetize activity. To do that, most large websites that survived the .com crash switched to what Tarnoff and another academic, Jathan Sadowski, call the online mall model, either renting out space on their websites the way YouTube or Amazon do, or going a step further and collecting and selling the digital footprint you leave while browsing. The consequences are well known and pretty obvious. In a system where profit is driven by rent and data, the competition is over who can occupy more of the internet's infinite space. Every click is monetized, every minute on each website is counted, and everything users do is kept track of to sell to the highest bidders.
Yeah, and without all of this, second thought, might not have the lucrative career that he enjoys right now as a socialist propagandist. But maybe he would prefer it that way. Maybe he would. It'd be like, it's like Selina Kyle from The Dark Knight Rises. If you guys have seen that movie, when Batman comes back to Gotham and he tries to recruit Selina Kyle to fight Bane, and she's like, I don't know, maybe I like it. Maybe I like Gotham City better this way. Maybe that's the attitude Second Thought has. Yeah, maybe it'd be better if I was wasn't making all this money.
Surveillance is not just the norm, it's more fundamental than that. It's the very fabric of the profitable internet. It bears repeating that if a service is
Profits.
free, you are the product. And the internet has also adopted the structure of capitalism internally during the privatization process. It's a place where unelected, all-powerful authority thrives. Like in a business, the most profit-hungry and wealthy have decision-making power over everyone else. Every decision about how to moderate a website like YouTube or Twitter isn't made through a process of collaborative deliberation and decision with a set of rules defined by and periodically reviewed by a democratic body.
Yeah, guys, it's not democratic. Yeah, that's what happens under capitalism. Private property owners, they get to decide how to dispose of their property as they see fit. And the majority doesn't get to vote their private property out of their hands.
That should be obvious by now. The CEO and board of directors just do whatever they think will please advertisers and investors. In practice, when it comes to political content specifically, this usually means tolerating white supremacist reactionary content as long as it brings in devoted, regular, and profitable engagement.
All right, so there's a few things to say about this. One, I think there's a lot of the pot calling the kettle black here. If we're going to talk about left versus right, I think the ugly elements on the right are way more ostracized and chased off of large corporate platforms, way more so than the ugly elements on the left. Not that I'm opposed to that. I'm not really opposed to private companies telling crazy people and people with horrible ideas to get the fuck out of here. But you notice like Alex Jones and Nick Fuentes types, they're not on YouTube anymore. But second thought is, communist Hassan Piker makes millions of dollars on Twitch as Google gives him the Streamy Award for the best streaming show in news.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
Vosh still has a pretty large reach on YouTube and Twitch, to my knowledge. If anything, these large companies treat communist types with kid gloves. No big deal or anything, though. No big deal or anything, you guys. It's only a failed ideology that routinely results in the death and impoverishment of millions of people whenever it's practiced.
Until the predictable point where this leads to a mass shooting or something like the storming of the Capitol in 2021. A quick crackdown later, and slowly the lucrative audience for reactionary content is allowed to trickle back in. And just like with
So the implication I get here is that mass shootings and horrible ideas like white nationalism and attempted coups, it's all the internet's fault. It's all capitalism's fault taking over the internet. Which is silly when you consider that stuff like this happened long before the internet. How do you guys explain the Nazis taking over Weimar Germany when there was no internet in Weimar Germany? But one thing I find amusing about all of this is he's blaming capitalism and the internet for white nationalist ideas and other horrible ideas spreading. You want to know which medium was a preferred medium for white nationalist types before the internet came around, which medium they used to spread their ideas? It wasn't corporate media networks. It wasn't corporate-owned newspapers that are that rely on corporate sponsors, and thus they're susceptible to backlashes and sponsors withdrawing. The medium that a lot of white nationalist types chose prior to the internet was public access cable news, or public access cable television. This is an article from the Associated Press from March of 1985, written by Susan Ashoff, where it talks about how the arrival of public access programming, cable TV channels made available to citizens for their own shows, has given the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups a new pulpit amid the Sunday church services, aerobics, and cooking classes. Opponents claim it does not matter because few people watch these shows. Cable and government officials who supervise programming generally take a hands-off stance. And to my knowledge, I took a broadcast law class when I was in college. And if I'm fuzzy on the details, if I'm mistaking anything, please feel free to correct me. But to my knowledge, cable television providers are required by law to offer a public access station to all of their subscribers. And in the community, I think the public access stations, they're required by law to make programming time to anyone in the community who wants it. And because we have a First Amendment in this country, the government, any government-owned television network, is thus not allowed to discriminate against any certain political ideology or ideas, so to speak. So this was a reason why cable television, public access cable TV stations, became a preferred medium for a lot of white nationalist types prior to the internet. So if Second Thought wants to apply this standard to the internet, where the public would own internet service providers, A likely consequence might be that it might have the opposite effect of his desired goal, of the problems he's talking about here. It might make it difficult for internet service providers and internet-based companies to screen for horrible ideas like white nationalism. Something worth thinking about.
And just like with traditional media, wealth buys influence online too. Since wealthy people tend to favor the things that make and keep them wealthy, this means that a heavily conservative and pro-capitalist bias dominates on the internet.
I'm not sure a lot of these right-wingers are necessarily pro-capitalism. You saw, you just featured Dennis Prager. Yeah, PragerU, they'll pay lip service to capitalism, talk about how wonderful it is before he goes to the Senate and bitches and moans, begging for the federal government to force Google, a private company, to carry his videos about the 10 Commandments.
Oh, you absolutely suck!
With goons like Shapiro, Crowder, and PragerU working with much bigger budgets than anti-capitalist creators. And I'm painfully aware of these things as a YouTuber myself. At any given time, a channel like this could just disappear, and there's not much I can do. If these videos are no longer in line with some advertising strategy, them's the breaks. It's not up to me or you. And increasingly, it's up to fewer and fewer people. The internet market is consolidating. Facebook has bought around 100 companies, including...
And Facebook is not doing so hot as of late for those who have been paying attention to the stock market. A lot of these tech companies are not doing so great.
Of course, Instagram and WhatsApp. Google's parent company Alphabet has acquired over 200, which of course includes YouTube. And Amazon Web Services, which tends to fly under the radar a bit, provides cloud servers to Netflix, Twitch, LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and countless other websites.
And I think it's also worth reminding that a lot of these companies, I mean, Facebook didn't even exist until the 2000s, but Amazon especially, in the 1990s, a lot of people thought it was ridiculous. Like, oh, what, you're going to sell books over the internet? Try to compete with giants like Borders and Barnes & Noble. Google was another one. Google in the 1990s, everyone thought Yahoo was the hot search engine. I think most people in the 90s thought Yahoo was going to be one of the big players in the internet for years to come. Google eventually took them over. Not took them over like as in acquired them, but just surpassed them. That's what I'm looking for. Surpassed Yahoo. Google surpassed Yahoo is what I'm trying to say. Also, Apple versus Microsoft in the 1990s. Microsoft was often talked about as this big, scary, unstoppable monopoly where Apple was on the verge of bankruptcy. And Apple has since become one of the largest players in tech.
Including those of some government services like the UK Ministry of Justice.
Now, will Amazon go the way of a Yahoo? Or, I mean, Microsoft is still a pretty big player, but I think it's worth reminding, guys, that the big players of today might not always be the big players of tomorrow. There's always room for, in a free market at least, there's always room for new competitors with better ideas and more of a hunger.
Ministry of Justice, all of whom therefore have to comply with AWS's terms of service. The ultimate authority over matters of censorship and general website function continues to concentrate more and more with the natural capitalist trend of mergers and acquisitions. And here I need to pause for a second, because a lot of this feels really obvious to say.
And also, yeah, MySpace was another big player. When Facebook was coming up, MySpace, you can Google MySpace monopoly, and a lot of people thought MySpace was a big, scary monopoly. I think you mentioned Netflix, too. When Netflix was just getting started, everyone talked about Blockbuster Video as the big, scary monopoly.
We've heard it a million times before that social media and other internet-y companies are exploiting our data and consolidating into fewer and fewer megacorporations trying to occupy as much of the online space as possible. But the reason I am so insistent is that not many discussions of these problems attach them explicitly to the shift to a capitalist model for the internet, and therefore, most solutions end up being short-sighted. Yes, there is a problem of regulation. These companies are absolutely acting against the interest of the public and should be regulated.
Acting against the interest of the public. What the fuck does that even mean? Huh? Acting against the interests of the public. This is the mentality of many statists and wannabe dictators and philosopher kings, from communists to fascists to religious theocrats. Operate on this notion that the public, the collective, the interests of the public, the interests of the collective takes precedence over the interests of the individual. In other words, you. Keep that in mind. Your rights and interests need to take a back seat for what's best for society. Who decides what's best for society? Well, I think you guys can figure that out. Yet people are still bewildered and perplexed at why socialism, when taken to its logical extreme, You often see purges and reigns of terror and hard labor camps. But at least they had good intentions, you guys.
And yes, there is a problem of monopoly. These companies are getting more powerful and harder to contest and contain by any means, both in the physical and digital space. But what is needed to fix these problems isn't just regulation and breaking up big tech. A capitalist system can always find the cracks in legislation and will always consolidate if given enough time, greasing the wheels of the legal system with its profits to keep doing it for as long as possible. We absolutely need these regulatory band-aids, but we can't leave the stabbing machine turned on. The problem is the capitalist organization of the internet itself. The fact that the internet can be a place for profit-seeking at all.
You guys get that? Why don't we slow that down really quick? Did you guys get that? Let's go back.
We can't leave the stabbing machine turned on. The problem is the capitalist organization of the internet itself. The fact that the internet can be a place for profit-seeking at all.
That's his problem. The fact that the internet is a place for profit-seeking at all. Do I gotta point at the sign, you guys? When you boil it all down, this whole debate about capitalism versus socialism, it's not about economics. It's not about market efficiency or whether or not the private sector can operate more efficiently, offer better products for lower prices with a healthy amount of competition in the market. When you boil it all down, it all comes down to ethics. Comes down to morality, comes down to altruism versus self-interest. Seeking profits is selfish. And if anyone who is new to my channel, watching me for the first time, if you think I'm attacking a straw man here, I've done other videos where Second Thought holds up altruism as the standard for morality. The thing that bothers people like Second Thought the most is, especially when the internet, the thing that bothers Second Thought the most about the internet is the fact that it has become a place where people and corporations have made massive profits. Anyway, what do you guys think? Do you guys buy into this gobbledygook?
No offense, but it sounds like some fucking commie gobbledygook.
Do you guys think that capitalism destroyed the internet? Why don't you guys let me know down in the comment section down below.